Okay, today's topic is addiction, specifically embodiment and addiction. I'm going to be looking at this sort of personally, tell you some stories about my life, look at it through working with other people, how it applies to pretty much everyone, even people who might not say, I'm an addict, I'm a alcoholic, whatever. Also look at it through the lens of decadence, kind of wider culture, and yeah, particularly the embodiment piece, I think, is what I bring to it, as well as just being a coach, to be honest. Like, there's a lot in that. All right, so let's get started. What is an addiction? Well, there's all sorts of definitions about out there, sort of official ones. I'll tell you the questions I ask people when someone says, hey, I might be an addict. Sometimes a coach or mentee, coachee or mentee will say that. I'll say, okay, do you do the thing even when you say you're not going to do the thing? So whether it's take a particular substance or a particular behavior, kind of see them in the same light. So is it compulsive would be that generally how that's talked about. So you say you're not going to do it and then you do it anyway. Even then though, I've got one more test, okay? That would be, is there a consequence? So this is another C. There's a model of 4 C's. What are the other C's? It's control, consequence, compulsive, and cravings. They're the 4 C's. So, the craving one would be, do you think about it a lot? Sometimes to call it an obsession. You obsess with it a lot. It's not the main one, though. For me, that one about consequences is really important. It's like, does it destroy other things in your life that you care about? And this is really critical, because someone might say, oh, I've got a chocolate addiction. But unless they're gaining loads of weight or, it's causing some health problem, whatever, I'm like, just enjoy your fucking chocolate. Someone has a drink at the weekend. They don't lose their job, they don't lose their kids. I go, well, even if it's quite difficult to stop taking something that is addictive in that way. But for me, is it really worth addressing if there isn't a consequence of the things you care about? This is really critical, actually. That it's destroying other things. And I always say to everyone I'm talking to, according to your values, right? According to your values. Now, you could take that to a fine level and say, well, if you're addicted to anything, even let's say something like, I don't know, I've got a mild coffee addiction again at the moment. I come and go with that one. It's probably my only current addiction. And you might say there's no consequence to that. I can always get coffee. It's not a big deal. But, I know people who are grumpy in the morning before their coffee. I know people who make mistakes because I don't know, had to go up early and go to the airport and didn't have their coffee that morning. So the consequences might not be huge, but there still might be some consequence. So you've got to go, all right, is that worth kind of the effort of, in this case, say, coming off coffee, which I've done before. And I know it's like 2 days of headaches and 2 days of feeling drained and I can do it. But it's like, is it sort of worth it? Usually what I do with coffee is usually wait till I've got a holiday or a slow period where it's not really going to particularly impact me. Is the consequence of giving up worse the consequence of doing it? Maybe there's cumulative health problems. The other one I would just say is there's something like it can be kind of an affront to your freedom. So most of us, I think, value freedom, particularly in Western culture, and anything which I feel not free over, as well as having these little unpleasant consequences, like ethically, how I treat people, how I act. It can be these small consequences. If you look at it through, say, when you're on meditation retreat, you might notice that. But also just like, I don't like being addicted to something. So I'll stay with coffee. For some people it's cigarettes. Again, it might not look like a lot of consequences, at least in the short term, to smoking. Obviously long term there's lots. But it's like, to me it's an affront to be a slave to something. It's against my values. So while I generally use this definition of, this check, of is it something you do when you say you're not going to do it, or is it compulsive? That already shows us a lack of freedom. You're not the boss of your own life at that point, right? And secondly, is it damaging other things? So people will continue with an addiction despite consequences, despite it having a negative effect. And I've seen, just briefly, my story that I'm sober. I think it's 17 years now. I actually lost track of the years at one point, which I regard as a good thing. Like some people have their sober birthday and they know every year. I know the date of my last, but I know the date of the year that I can celebrate that by. I haven't tracked it, but it's been quite a few years. I used to be a full-blown alcoholic. From the age of about 16, 17, to the ages of to the age of 27. You could probably work that out, how many years that is. I'm 44 now. So I had a solid 10 years of more or less nightly drinking. This could be, there was some drug addiction in there too, but mostly it was around alcohol for me. There was other addictions along the way, amphetamines and other things, but mostly it was alcohol. And sometimes you might think of an alcoholic as someone who drinks in the morning, right? People have these different kind of criteria for it. But I was definitely compulsive. It was just every night. I couldn't sleep without it, actually. I literally just couldn't go to sleep. I could have like the odd night off. I'd have a night off and just couldn't sleep. It was awful. When I was hyper motivated, the maximum I ever had was like 2 or 3 weeks off. And generally it wouldn't be more than a few days. Sometimes I'd control it. At one point I had it controlled, so I worked in an office, and I used to just drink Saturday and Sunday. I used to drink at the weekends. I used to get absolutely obliterated. As soon as I walked out of the office on Friday, I'd go straight to get a beer. Key thing there is an obsession as well. That kind of like mental obsession. So even if there's control, it's like it takes work. Like, I remember what it was like to sit in a pub and just go, right, I'm just going to have a few tonight. I'm going to have 3, right? Then I won't be hungover tomorrow. And sometimes I would do that. So it wasn't 100% compulsive. Yeah, there's other times I totally failed. Like I say, right, I'm not going to drink, and I'd walk by an off license. That's what would that be called in America? A bottle shop or whatever, a place you buy alcohol. And I would just find myself in there buying alcohol. But I was like, well, it's not spirits, so does that count? It can be a lot of denial. Or I'm not drinking in the morning, does that count? So it's still pretty compulsive. And even when I resisted those compulsions, it was hard work. Hence the obsession. I'd be like absolutely thinking about it. Go, right, yeah, counting the days till Friday or counting the hours to the end of the day. And there is a sort of cost benefit analysis. Like when I was young, I could do Aikido in the evening, get smashed afterwards. Class would finish at 10, I'd be smashed by 11. Wake up for lectures 8 or 9 a.m. the next day at university, and I'd be fine. I'd just shake it off. By lunchtime, I had plenty of coffee, I was good. And I'd always drink orange juice mixed with water. I had my like hungover cure. It's always like half orange juice, half water, 50%, and a bunch of coffee. And by lunch I'd shake it off. And I had like a reasonable life. But over time, the hangovers got longer. Also, the pleasure you get from something diminishes. This is a really key thing to understand addiction. Is you first drink because it's fun. I had some good times drinking, I had some good times drugging. I'm not going to deny it. Some great parties, some great, even whole periods of my life that were wild and a lot of fun. But the fun gets less. And what happens is, sometimes it's like, the man takes a drink, the drink takes a drink, the drink takes the man. That's the saying you'll hear. And that the enjoyment of it goes. So, there's people that study this sort of biochemically in terms of neuroscience and dopamine and things like that. But you go from sort of 0 to +1, and then you're just going from -1 to 0. For me, that's another sign there's an addiction. So again, take an example many people can relate to. Caffeine, you're not using caffeine for energy, you're using caffeine to not be drained, right? So it's like, waking up and going, I need caffeine just to function. Yeah. And for some people, that's so normal. It's like with coffee, that they forgot what it's like to wake up in the morning and actually, feel good without it. I can remember that because caffeine's one that comes and goes for me. And I have months on, months off. Usually sort of about 50-50, I'd say, of my life has been caffeinated. And the tricky thing with addiction is you want to get that +1, right? You want to get that +1, feeling happier or more energized or more relaxed, whatever the state you want is. But it's very easy to then keep doing that. And there is definitely certain kinds of people who are predisposed to that. Okay, I'll say what those might be in a bit. There's a few different categories and a few different people who are at risk, let's say. That being said, this is a very human thing to change one's state. Actually, animals do it too. Animals will get drunk and roll down hills and do all sorts of stuff to change their state. We are an animal that changes its state any way it can, through dancing, through drumming, through psychedelics, all these different ways. A key thing with addiction, though, is you need it just to function, right? So, for example, psychedelics I have taken and continue to take about once a year, just from a mental health point of view. I think more than that's not good. Some people say, that's a break in sobriety, that's a drug. But I've never woken up the next day from taking psychedelics. Well, I want to do it again. And And I remember with alcohol, as a teenager, I'd drink with my friends at a party, and the next day I'd be like, "Oh, I fancy a beer," and my friends would be like, "What the hell? What do you mean you fancy a beer?" It's quite obvious there was some kind of a difference between me and them at a young age. Equally, I had a friend that used to smoke a lot of weed, still smokes a fair bit, and they would smoke weed, and like I would smoke with them, and then the next day I wouldn't want to go again, and they would. Right, they'd be like right back at it, straight away before they got out of bed, rolling their first spliff. So there does seem to be individual differences around substances, and again, I'll say why maybe in a bit. Actually, I'll say now. So in terms of like where your brain chemistry is set to, do you need an upper or a downer? It tends to be uppers or downers that get addictive, not so much like psychedelics. Yeah, it tends to be uppers and downers. So we have this very broad category of like drugs, and some of them are legal, some of them are not. Some of them are legal, some places, not others. They're actually quite broad categories, and I just think it's usually up, down, and sideways. Sideways being psychedelics tends to be the psychedelics don't lead to addiction, though I have seen people get more like psychologically addicted to sort of having a sort of very special experience and use it as a form of escapism where it has some addictive qualities, but not anywhere near as up, the up and down. It's because a sort of biochemical element to that. So the uppers would be things like cocaine, amphetamines, nicotine. Down there's alcohol, even though it can make people emotionally less inhibited, which can look like it's an upper because they start, more emotions, more fun, more partying, more angry sometimes, whatever. That's the disinhibition side. It's actually a sort of downer. It's just generally regarded as a sedative. Yeah, it makes you less sensitive. So for those of us who are wired upbeat, that might be very appealing. So in terms of the downer side of it. So this may be a difference between people. What can make you wired upbeat? Well, I think some of it's just personality. Some of us are anxious people, and that relaxing, everything's okay, feeling of safety you get from alcohol, and you get that from opiates too. I've had some opiate use, not a huge amount, but some. That feeling of everything okayness. So who else might need that? Well, think about people with trauma. Trauma is a smashing of that sense of safety and potentially a hyper-arousal with it. That's being stuck in that sympathetic fight or flight response. Obviously, this freeze response too. So the sympathetic response can be dampened by downer use. This is why you'll find, trauma associated with alcohol and with opiate use, that kind of thing, because it's people with nervous systems that need calming. That also brings us just generally to the modern world. So if we're in a world which is generally agitated, we're not very well co-regulated. Particularly, we're not in a village, we're not in a community, we're not, we could say, theoregulated. We don't have the sense of meaning that kind of tribal people, many even past societies in the West that had a sense of meaning, had a sense of purpose. If you lack a sense of meaning and purpose, and particularly if you lack a sense of co-regulation, and if you're not spending much time in nature, and you lack a sense of what we could call eco-regulation, all those things are down-regulating you, you're going to be fucking wired, yeah? And you're going to need something to take the fucking edge off. So it's like, yes, no wonder there's so much addiction in the modern world. Gabor Mate talks about this, talks about trauma, talks about, the kind of lack of co-regulation. So if we're not in those communities, we're not in nature, we're not in systems of meaning, systems of belief, potentially religion, could be others, we're in trouble. And I see this time and time again that people who are particularly don't have meaning, they look for pleasure as a way to deal with that. So this brings in the narrative. Those of you who follow my YouTube channel on decadence, or done workshops with me on that, if we're in a decadent society, that's a society which lacks meaning. The general meaning of the society has gone down as a whole. We're not just given that meaning as you would if you were, I don't know, an ancient Aztec, or even someone from the 18th century in the UK, for example. You would have been told, look, you're Christian and you're spreading the great English way, or whatever the narrative was at the time. And there may be problems with those narratives, of course. I wouldn't necessarily ascribe to being either an Aztec or an 18th century colonial English person. However, there was meaning given. So in our decadent societies where we lack meaning, particularly there's lack of religion, very secular society, lack of spiritual beliefs, what that can lead to is addiction, because you've got to get through life's hardships somehow. Life is tough. It's like, how are you going to face, I don't know, let's take a Buddhist model, old age, disease and death. This is just something we are subject to. People we love dying, getting older, getting ill, difficult things. How are you going to cope with that without a system of meaning? So when there's less meaning, people need pleasure just to survive, to get through the day or the night. In my case, it was the night. Hedonism becomes a thing. Hedonistic culture is a recipe for addiction. Now, there's some people that may become addicts in other cultures and other situations, but I definitely see that. Trauma too, as I said, creates that need for regulation of some kind, usually down regulation. It could be up regulation. It could be to feel alive. Hence, I don't know, behavior like cutting, cutting oneself might seem like, okay, this is obviously a destructive thing. Clearly, this is a destructive thing. But if someone feels alive, that might be the up regulation, the feeling something rather than nothing, I've heard people say. Equally, behaviors that may give a sense of control. I've heard this around eating disorders and anorexia. People saying, there's a sense of control that comes with that. Addictions also are very, not entirely, but very socially contagious. So, for example, I spoke to a counsellor recently, and she was counselling a young woman in school that was cutting. I said, "Where did you get the idea for this?" And she said, "Oh, I saw it on TikTok." Right? So it's not that she wouldn't have done something to regulate herself otherwise. She might still have that dysregulated nervous system, but the ideas for addictions or the accessibility, like alcohol is everywhere in our society. Nicotine is much more acceptable than heroin. Sugar is everywhere. Some people say that's an addiction. Some people say not. I mean, in a way, all addictions just hit the little reward button in your brain. Yeah, hit that little reward button that makes you feel good for a time. Another definition of addiction I sometimes work with is anything can be addictive if it temporarily solves a problem that it also makes worse. Okay, so think about that. If alcohol makes you relax, but then the next day you're more anxious, that is what happens with alcohol. Most people have had that just with a hangover, just feeling a bit crappy, right? Not just dehydrated or whatever, but like emotionally from it. That's pretty normal experience, I think. So you have one uncle who just doesn't get hangovers no matter what he drinks, and obviously his cost-benefit analysis is very different. And his even though he can drink a lot, you'd think, oh, that's going to make him more addictive, but he can take it or leave it because he doesn't have that extra problem to solve. All right, so it's solving the problem and creating a bigger problem. Same problem usually, yeah. So that's the cycle of alcohol. There may be emotional versions of that, like you do things on meth and you're ashamed of them, then you take meth so you don't feel ashamed, right? So vicious cycles. Trauma has loads of these vicious cycles. A really interesting way of looking at the world, actually. Eating can have that, right? I feel bad about my body, so I eat to feel better. Okay, well now you're stuck in a cycle. A certain degree of addiction is just habit. Right? It doesn't even have to have this biochemical addiction. It's just, there's a degree of just you do it because that's what you do. It's just habit. You could look at that through a Pavlovian lens. There's a certain reward that's coming every time you do it. And the consequence is usually delayed, right? It's like, oh, fuck it. Sometimes they call that the fuck it button, hitting the fuck it button when there's a consequence. But it's like, you know what? That's in the future. Future Homer can deal with that is a fun way I heard that said on The Symptoms. Future Mark can deal with that. So yes, that bringing of the future into the present can be useful. So one technique is a play it forward technique, where you go, if I do this, how is this going to affect my marriage, my children, my work? And you actually go, what happens if I do this? So you're trying to bring the future consequence into the present to change that relationship, yeah? Well, I'm jumping around a bit here, bear with me. Also was talking about meaning there. So often in different groups or support groups, the classic one being what's called 12-step or Alcoholics Anonymous, and then that spread to Narcotics Anonymous, Overeaters Anonymous, blah, blah, blah. One of the main solutions they offer is co-regulation, the group, and there's often sort of ritualistic elements to it, not in a culty way, but you'll say a thing together, or there's certain things you do every week, and that just repetition. You see how children like that? Well, it's also people with agitated nervous systems like that. I can go into an AA meeting all over the world, and I have, and I recommend that. So most people benefit a lot from 12-step. You'll find a lot of haters on the internet about 12-step, but here's what you've got to understand. It's more or less free. There's no cult authority. You don't get told exactly, you're told take up a religion or a particular thing. But they do say you need some kind of a higher power and something that's bigger than you. One, you need some meaning and belief. Second thing, it's like taking your ego out of the center of your world. Yeah. So often there's what they call service work, and that might be something as simple as making the tea or answering the phones to new people. Or you might have heard of sponsorship, where you take someone under your wing. I've done that, and sort of help them out, and you go for coffee with them and talk to them. And that can be that kind of service work. Is again, it's about putting yourself out of the center. Tends to be that addicts or people who are inclined towards this. Though again, there's a scale, and the modern world means sort of everyone's got a bit of this now, I would say. But there's definitely those of us who have got you see certain personality characteristics. The main two groups I see are either the people pleasers, not me, but I definitely have seen those groups. There's definitely a bigger prevalence of trauma in 12-step, though again, I've got friends who seem to have a great childhood and no trauma, but it's definitely more likely if there's trauma. But the other one you'll see is sort of big ego, intelligent, creative, driven, but with a big ego. That's my category. And you'll see a lot of us in different, we call it in rooms, in 12-step rooms of different kinds, usually church halls and things in England. In America, they might have special dedicated rooms, who tend to be quite successful, who tend to be intelligent and driven. You don't meet many stupid alcoholics. You meet a lot of troubled alcoholics, you meet a lot of asshole alcoholics, but we tend to be a little bit self-centered, a little bit ego-centered, and that kind of putting spirituality and service at the center of things really seems to help. It really seems to help with the addiction. Interestingly, not all being about me. So yeah, that move towards service tends to be a move of emotional maturity. On that note, what is interesting about addicts and alcoholics is they don't develop emotional maturity while they're using. Okay, why not? Because they're using to fix their problems rather than actually sitting with the difficult emotions, and that's how we grow up. We grow up with facing difficulties emotionally and practically. So sort of one, it's a bit of a cliche, it's not entirely true, but one way of looking at this is like your emotional development stopped the year you started drinking. So for me, that was say 16, 17, I was drinking alcoholically. When I was 27, I wasn't really 27. It was more like I was 16. It's like I missed 10 years of emotional development. I'm 44 now, and I still feel about 33 in terms of emotional development. And some things have come to me very late, let's say. There is this thing of, I touched on this earlier, is it that you have generalized addictive tendencies, or is it specific to a substance? I think it's a bit of both. I've definitely known people who, I never got addicted to weed, even though I was around it quite a lot. It was always alcohol, yeah. There are other things, however, I've got addicted to, social media at times, amphetamines, coffee. I only have to have a couple of coffees and I'm back on that one. Smoking, interestingly, was less addictive for me. Compulsive sexual behaviors is definitely one I've had issues with. And you can get substitute addictions. So it's like I gave up alcohol, but then my dating was just not good. It just wasn't good. And, never did anything awful, but I definitely took risks I shouldn't. I definitely was careless. Definitely was compulsive. And this is where you might go, is that the ADHD or the addiction? Are they the same? Do they cross over with trauma? Yeah, these things can all cross over and it's hard to separate out. But I am prone to compulsive behavior. I am prone to unboundary behavior. I am prone to impulsive behavior to this day. So sometimes I just need really firm rules. I do not do that. I've never gone into a gambling shop, ever. I will not gamble. I will not even start gambling. I kind of accidentally got into it through cryptocurrency investing and then realized, like, shit, I'm become a gambling addict through this. Damn. And at a certain point, I knocked it on the head and said, enough of that. This isn't good for me. And I, if people ask me, like, hey, do you want to put a bet on the horses? Come into the bookies. Bookies is a gambling place in the UK. I would just go, no. I've literally never stepped foot in one because I know what I'm fucking like. Yeah. Again, around dating and things, I've established different boundaries now. Some things I've looked at like therapeutically. Some things I just sort of like, I don't know, Facebook was a real issue for a while, that I'd be on Facebook and a little bit over provocative and poking people. And people think I'm doing that now, but I'm really not. And I very rarely spend time on Facebook anymore. I just find it unpleasant. Sometimes you can have what the Buddhists call insight, when you really see through something. Now, in some addictions, you can see through it and go, wow, I'm not having a good time anymore. Or, wow, these consequences are serious. Because there's often a lot of self-deception in addiction. One of the ways a sort of addict is defended is like, oh, I haven't got a problem, I can quit anytime. It's like the self-deception side of it. But when you get past that kind of insight, and sometimes that's enough. Some people have that insight and they're just done. They're just done. I've gradually had that insight with social media, for example, and how I was acting there. Other things need a lot of work for me in the sort of dating kind of sexual sense. I just needed to look at it therapeutically, and I did. I spent several years really looking at it, establishing different lines, looking at it in different ways through different lenses. And that had a lot of fruit. I actually had a psychedelic experience, which really kind of put the nail in that coffin. I think pretty much permanently and pretty much done now. Like, fingers crossed, but it's certainly, I've had far less issues with that for a while after having it flagged and doing some serious work on myself. And that's the difficult ones. I think the most difficult in a way are things like food addiction and stuff that involves normal behavior. So sexuality is a normal behavior, and you can justify being very liberal or being very, sort of liberal orientated person. You can justify a lot. Same with food, right? It's like you have to eat. You don't have to drink. You don't have to have sexual relations, but most people do of some kind, right? It's a normal part of life. Food, I really feel sorry for who that's their primary thing. I have some sugar addiction eating issues at times, and I can definitely overeat or comfort eat as a way to regulate. I notice every time I go on a work trip, particularly if it's a big city and I'm not with friends and I'm a bit lonely, every time I'm in London, it's stressful. I'm always like, eating loads of shit in London just as a way to self-regulate. And part of me goes, you know what? I'm not hurting anyone else. Okay, it's nothing that's going to kill me if as long as I don't do it all the time and put on massive amounts of weight. So sometimes you can let yourself have a little secondary addiction. Like when people are getting sober from alcohol, one of the bits of advice is eat sweets, carry sweets around, eat sugar. And some people say, no, it's terrible because it sets off the addiction pathways in your brain and those pathways are shared. Other people say, well, it gets you through the day. Again, I can see it both ways. And it's certainly at times I'm going, I developed a little computer game addiction while very, very stressed and unhappy last year. And I was like, you know what? There's worse things I could be doing than playing this little game on my computer. And then I started to spend money on it. And I realized I was spending quite a lot of money and I had to knock it on the head, right? So again, for those of us who struggle with all or nothing, control can be difficult. And sometimes just not doing it, going black and white on it, is easier. I remember explaining this to a child once. He says, why can't you just have a beer like my dad? And I said, well, if I have one beer, it makes it harder to not have another beer. And that makes it harder to not have another beer. So it's just easier if I don't have the first drink. That's the Alcoholics Anonymous kind of recommendation. I had tried sort of harm reduction and cutting down. And for some people that works. Some people just have that insight where they see through it and they just, on a deep level, insight's not just cognitive knowing. It's a deep emotional grokking, you could say. That insight can be enough, certainly with psychedelics. I've seen people like throw all their heroin needles away and have that huge insight. Certain psychedelic substances seem to be good for that. Mushrooms, is it ibogaine? There's various ones that people swear by. Ayahuasca, I've heard people say they had that experience where they have that insight. Other people, they need to do the work slowly. A lot of people need some kind of program to maintain their not needing to self-regulate so badly. So, for example, the 12-step meetings provide the co-regulation. For me, things that help me regulate so I'm not so reliant upon substances that may be dangerous. Could be having a little other side addiction that's not so harmful. And I've seen people in the sobriety really get into cycling or hot yoga or, anything intense tends to be, give me that hit. And some of those I'm like, all right. But again, even the guy I knew who did hot yoga ended up doing hot yoga twice a day and it became really unhealthy for him. I ended up giving him a bad heart. So even something like yoga, you've got to be careful of. I had a gym addiction last year, like really hitting the gym way too hard. And at a certain point, I cut back. I didn't have to go all or nothing on that one, but I went from, 3 hours in the gym 4 days a week. It's a lot. It's a lot of time in the gym, right? Really hitting it and then crashing afterwards usually, which was affecting my work. Again, there's our criteria. Now I think it's like an hour 3 times a week I do now. It's pretty chill. It's probably a much healthy amount. Don't have the big cortisol crash from it. So in order to co-regulate, to have the different other kinds of regulation, things that have helped me. So let me just go through what's helped me. A lot of this will apply to people listening, not all of it. Different things work for different people. Some kind of meditation. Absolutely, you'll hear meditation or prayer, they'll say in AA. And I think both can be useful, have a different function, higher power, plus just a general self-regulation. I've seen meditators you'll see people that come into addiction, they cannot sit still. We used to do a 10-minute meditation, no, 5-minute meditation in an early morning AA group I used to go to. And I used to see people who were new and they'd be fidgeting and checking their phone and going outside. They couldn't handle it. And then after a few months of sobriety, gradually, in doing that, they build that muscle. I know for me, it really helps when I'm meditating, build that muscle regularly. So meditation. Next one, exercise. A lot of alcoholics have that like charge in their system. I do boxing twice a week. I do the gym 3 times a week. Each of them is just like half an hour, an hour. So it's not a huge drain on my time. It's not fucking me up. Those just help my entire nervous system settle. They're just brilliant. So exercise, I think, is underrated. It can give a sort of positive addiction or a little bit of a nice buzz or a little bit of a relaxating effect. The co-regulation, absolutely. I spend time in nature every day. I've deliberately actually moved to being in nature. Lived next to a park when I lived in the city. That really helped. I used to walk along the beach when I lived by the coast. That really helped. So for me, living in a sort of calm environment that's aesthetic, but also particularly the nature connection. Spiritual connection of different kinds, I've mentioned. Gratitude practice. There seems to be this weird link between addiction and resentment. They'll sometimes say in 12-step, resentment is the biggest killer. It does seem that practicing gratitude is hugely helpful for addicts, putting them in a more positive mindset. Sometimes an addict, I just feel like my mind, like I was born maybe, probably the trauma I had later on didn't help, but I feel like my dad was an alcoholic, and there is a genetic component to addiction. We should mention that actually. Like there's certain Native American tribes where 100% of them that drink get alcoholism. So there's like whole dry reservations in the States. I think Aboriginals also. Now it's difficult because some of that could be like cultural, being cut off from culture and trauma from colonization, blah, blah, blah. Yes, but it does look like there's a genetic component. Some Asians, for example, will just go really red when they drink. And that's just really unpleasant for them. So it's hard for them to get addicted to alcohol because they just go red-faced and it's just not very nice, right? So there is a genetic component as well as a trauma component, personality component. ADHD crossover is complex, as you can hear, but there's a few different parts to it. So where was I? So, yeah, I feel just like I was born wired a bit differently, if I'm honest. It's interesting that AA says that alcoholism is a disease. I'm not sure if that's quite the right model. I think it was an improvement on what previously people said sort of it's a moral weakness, and that just wasn't very helpful. There's now more, biopsychosocial models now. There's definitely the sort of obsession, the disease part, the restless, irritable, and discontent. That's the fight-flight part that they talk about in 12-step before they knew the sort of polyvagal version of it, before they knew about trauma. But that was observed in people, that there was that restless, irritable, and discontent quality. And, unless I do the things, I have that. So I know now if I do the things, and the things are social support, preferably meetings, but also just friendships, nature, exercise, meditation, bit of gratitude. If I do those things, I'm more or less okay. A bit of service, helping other people, I'm more or less okay. It's like 6, 7, maybe 8 things. It's not nothing. It is a bit of work, but it's a whole lot less work than I was spending being an alcoholic, right? And, I know those things work for me because I've successfully stayed sober. In that time I've had, I'd say, relapses into other addictions. Some things that were harmful, some things that were, financially harmful, a little bit harmful to other people. I'm certainly not proud of some of my behaviour in that time. I wouldn't say it was sober behaviour even if I wasn't drinking. I'd say now, as I said, I think caffeine is my last sort of current addiction, and that's relatively easy for me to get rid of. So I've had some success with these things, and I've had a life, right? Honestly, the stats on recovery aren't good. So even if you go to, say, I don't know, the Priory, which is like top level alcohol and drug addiction recovery centre that the celebrities go to, even if you go to the Priory, your chances are maybe 1 in 3 of being sober the rest of your life. And about 1 in 3 they call revolving door, which is like in and out. You have some harm reduction, but then some relapses. I think I'm mostly the first category, though if you go cross-substance, cross-behaviours, I'm a bit of the second category. And the third category of just, you still die. like this seriously fatal. There's a lot of people who just die from addictions. Your odds aren't great, even with good help. I'd never went to the Priory, and these things can cost like £50,000, £10,000. There are government available ones in the UK, but there's huge waiting list. It's not as easy for people to get them. I've seen people spend no money, and that's very beautiful. If you can go to 12 step and literally you put £1 in the pot, you don't even have to do that. It's the largest anarchist, self-run, non-profit organisation, I think, in the world with millions of members. It's not even a membership. You don't have to sign up for anything other than having some kind of higher power. And there are traditions which people generally follow. My psychedelics, for example, is probably breaking one of those. Other people say, oh, you're not sober. They get really hardline and fundamentalist about it. You tend to find, because addicts, alcoholics, etc., are a bit boundaryless, that sometimes when they get sober, they get a bit overly boundaried. You get sort of fundamentalists, and Alcoholics Anonymous does have a big book, and some people treat it almost like a Bible or something. They quote from it, and it gets a little bit culty. For some people, generally not for more healthy sober people. People often go for a stage when they're a little bit fundamentalist. That's not always a bad thing. We might need to get boundaries back and overdo them before you kind of loosen it up. But yeah, as I said before, you'll find a lot of haters for stuff like 12-step. But then I just think, well, hang on a minute. It's not, no one's making you do anything. No one's making loads of money. There's no abuse, hopefully, going on. Though, of course, human beings will, but it's not systematic or anything. I just think, well, why are people hating on it? And often that's overrepresented because people on the internet who are anonymous tend to stay anonymous. There's a movement now towards loosening that, hence me talking about it now. I'd say if you're in your first year of sobriety, best keep it quiet. And, it's something you can mention. I think once you get a bit more sober, it helps let people know about it. It's good to let people know that this stuff exists, that it can be helpful. It's definitely been helpful to me. And as I say, I've seen Buddhist versions work for people. There are secular versions out there, so I don't want to say everyone should do it, right? I'd say give it a good try. If you've got a serious addiction that's causing you problems, I was a total screw up. Alcoholism was really impacting my health. It was definitely impacting potential career. It was, putting me in situations that were dangerous. It was really impacting my life. Those 10 years of alcoholism really impacted me. And some of the secondary addictions, compulsive behaviours afterwards, again, lost friends, lost colleagues, upset people, behaved in ways that were below my standard. Nothing, as I said, nothing criminal, nothing like I'm going to go to jail, but stuff that was just a bit shitty, a bit shady, stuff that I genuinely regret now. And that is one of the horrors, actually, of addiction, is you act in a way that's below your morals or ethics. So if you're a psychopath, you screw people over and don't care about it. But there's a saying that a junkie, a drug addict, will steal your wallet and help you look for it. There's a horror in continuously, first of all, achieving less than you can, being way less than your potential. I saw my potential just going with the alcoholism. I thought, God, if I'm going to do anything with my life, I need to get sober, because I could already see I was well below my potential, even in those young years where I got away with some of it. And I've done things in my life now, the Embodiment Conference or the Sane Ukraine Project or running Embodiment Unlimited. I've done some things, and I wouldn't have been able to do that if I was still drinking. There's no way. And the other horrible thing is, you act in ways that are not according to your own values, right? There's definitely been times I thought, I could have treated people better in that regard, whether it be work or dating or, whatever it was. And that is something you can really sit with a lot of regret, try and do better in the future, try and play it forward. But I'd say, I've had a life. I'd almost certainly be dead by now had I not stopped the drinking and drugging. There's some of the things that help me. As I said, meditation, exercise, 12-step program, nature, psychedelics at times help me get breakthroughs, though not always. There's probably more I could say, but it's time for lunch. So I'm going to wrap this up. I'd say if you're out there and you think you might have an addiction, check it out. Talk to some people who know. If you go to an AA meeting, for example, nobody will tell you you're an alcoholic. You just listen to other people's experience. It's actually, as a coach, this is like the genius of it. I do coach people on this rarely. So if people are local, I sometimes sponsor them for free. If they're wealthy and further forward, then it's a paid thing. I can do coaching. So I didn't do this episode to advertise that, but do get in touch if that's something that might be helpful. As I said, unless you're local, it's it's a paid thing. And there are addiction counselors who are paid as well, coaches, as well as 12-step, which you don't have to pay. You can get a sponsor without paying. Yeah. So you don't need to pay. So go to those groups, listen to people's experience. As I said, the genius of their approach is they say, we're not going to tell you what to do. You're not going to tell you if you're an alcoholic. Listen to my experience and see if you relate. Listen to the similarities, not the differences. Obviously, people have different lives. I could be listening to a gay guy share. I could listen to like a Filipino woman share, whatever, different lives. But you hear the similarities, the behaviors, the compulsiveness, the cravings, the damage to your life. You hear those different things. And, sometimes there's like a weird language. You'll talk about someone hitting rock bottom and you'll be like, what's that? So sometimes there's a language you have to listen to and, learn. And then like maybe some of the materials are written in like 1930s Midwest American English. It takes a bit of that translating. But I find it quite beautiful, the old-fashioned language of some of the 12-step books. No one's going to force you into anything. If they do, then they're not, they're not doing it right. And it's worth checking out. Just going, okay, is it impacting my life enough that it's worth doing something about? I think that's the question. And you could do a lot worse than 12-step. But as I said, if 12-step didn't work for you, first of all, check out a few meetings. Like there was one meeting in Brighton where people would throw chairs and scream, and it was just really mental meeting. And there's other meetings that were like super lovely, super chill. It's like worth checking out, like 5 or 6 meetings of different types, if you're lucky enough to have access to that many. And there's online meetings, Zoom meetings, if you're stuck in the countryside or don't have a car or whatever. So check out a few meetings, listen to people before you kind of make your mind up. And then there are plenty of other approaches out there if you definitely decide that's not for you. Whether it's private coaching or government schemes, different Buddhist schemes, secular schemes, whatever. Anyway, I'm rambling and I'm hungry. It's time for lunch. So I hope that helps. And I hope there's something in that for people out there.